Episode 16, The American Cow, Origin Story. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at what exactly is a cow, how they came to the future U.S., and how different North cow life was from South cow life. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. First of all, we need to go back and look at where cows start because there is controversy, and there is controversy within the controversy. In Western history, the narrative has more or less been there were aurochs, which are these ferocious, giant European bovines that can be seen in the 20,000-year-old Lascaux cave paintings. I've got a link in the show notes. They were mentioned as slightly smaller than elephants by the well-traveled Chatty and known to exaggerate Julius Caesar. They were hunted for sport, usually by the ruling class, all the way up into about the 17th century, when the last one died in Poland. All cow species were descended from these megafauna aurochs. They had shrunk down to more reasonable sizes and been selected for better attitudes by the people living in Central Asia and Mesopotamia around 10,000 years ago. And all cows in the world came from there. However, any European who went on a grand tour that included a trip to see the pyramids or invaded India for spices and settled in to mess about with the cloth trade could not help but notice that Egypt and India had cows which, while clearly cows, did not look like European cows. They gave milk that was different in fat content than European cows and were much better at this hot weather thing. And then during the exploration of the New World, conquistadors and other explorers would come upon something they called Mexican bulls, and others would report these giant, shaggy, ground-thundering bovines that were kind of cows, but scarier than cows and wild. These were American bison, though are known to most modern Americans as buffalo, which they aren't. So for centuries, there was some suspicion that not all cows came from Mesopotamia, but not enough interest to really dig into that idea. As with many things I'm researching, the trend of 21st century DNA technology, combined with the tendency in the last 2 decades to have disparate history fields work together to answer questions cooperatively, has found some much more satisfying and detailed answers. Now, there has been some digging into the only one cow starting point, only one place cows were domesticated idea. Combining DNA research with archaeology, specifically the examination of cave, tomb, and pottery art, along with some paleontology centered around ancient bovids, have shown that there were multiple instances of cow domestication, and from more than one bovine ancestor. After all, there's far more ancient rock art than just Lascaux in France. There are examples on every continent except Antarctica. And rock art all over Africa keeps featuring bovine species. In South Africa, in the ancestral lands of the San people, there are vivid scenes of human-cow interaction that are at least 25,000 years old. In modern Somaliland in East Africa, there are paintings showing that people, if not actually milking cattle, they are definitely aware of the significance of cow udders at least 20,000 years ago. Links to these pictures are also in the show notes. As for those impressive and intimidating aurochs, there is a consensus that yes, there was sort of an aurochs, a general ancestral breed that split into 3 subspecies. The Indian one, which had the hump, which is still a feature of many hot weather types of cattle. The Eurasian one, which is the direct ancestor of all Central Asian and European cattle, and the North African one, which seems to be largely similar to the Eurasian one and may actually differ mainly due to the separation of the Mediterranean Sea. All 3 groups of these aurochs had the important features: major sexual dimorphism, in this case noticeable size difference and behavior between males and females, the bifurcated hooves, the horns, and the ruminant style of eating, where they eat, partially digest, and then re-chew grasses, that would be the cud, backed up by the 4-chambered stomach, where they ferment and thus can more completely digest low-quality grasses in ways other herbivores can't. Wild cattle of smaller dimensions developed in not just that agricultural hotbed of Mesopotamia, but in Asia and Africa as well. We are pretty confident that Eurasian cattle were domesticated around 10,000 years ago and spread in various forms as far north and west as Ireland and as far south and east as Persia. But there's been less study of, so there are fewer answers about the descendants of the humped Indian aurochs. When did it develop into the zebu cattle known from many a Hindu statue and Egyptian tomb frieze? How and when did it spread down the east coast of the African continent? The interruption of the Sahara Desert created an interesting mixing bowl all along its southern border of the humped zebu cattle and the North African and Eurasian aurochs descendants. The ebbing and flowing of the desert over the millennia, mixed with the continual trade routes across and around the Sahara, meant that all sorts of mixes of wild and imported cattle happened. Jumping ahead from the misty past, when we get to about 6,000 years ago, local wild cattle had been repeatedly semi-domesticated in multiple locations. And it was based on the study of bovine mitochondrial DNA. Apparently, it was not uncommon to breed the cow descendants of the Eurasian aurochs with the cow descendants of the Indian aurochs. When and how much and whether it was purposeful in domesticated herds or among wild herds is a big part of what is unclear and under debate. The speed of genetic flow in wild cattle and semi-domesticated cattle is a newish field of study, so many of the timelines are unclear. It was thought the genetic mixing went only one way, but emerging understanding about cattle transport by sea from Europe and back and forth from the Americas, especially in South America, since the 16th century has made things even more complex. But controversies aside, breed improvement by making purposeful outcrosses with different cow breeds has been going on for a long time. When this was done by pastoral or herding societies and agricultural societies, they would work to emphasize the traits they most valued, like larger or smaller size, different sized horns, better tempers for plowing and draft use, or higher milk production. But the local breeds would never be wholly replaced because they had better resistance to local diseases and would be suited to local water supplies. For centuries, history has documented the trades in gold, art, salt, silks, and spices, but largely leaves out the trade in pack, draft milk, and meat-producing livestock, partly because these were harder to trace and the technology needed to do a good job of it is pretty new, but also because ideas like, quote, how cow dung management was important to the development of the modern world, unquote, has historically been a harder sale. I mean, until recently, I'd never even thought about the history of large animal husbandry as a thing. But it is, and along with art and sales records, they also use things like DNA and stable isotopes of carbon. So fast forward again, this time to the 16th century age of European exploration. Cow herding is reasonably well established all around the Mediterranean and in the flatter and less arid parts of the Middle East. In the rest of the African continent, it is sprinkled across the southern edge of the Sahara Desert and all the way up and down the east coast. It's present in profusion all over the Indian subcontinent and anywhere in East Asia where it works with the local established agricultural practices. And the bovine waters are further muddied by the prolific use of different yak and water buffalo species. Those are all the ones that look like they're sporting a foam wig of a late 50s, early 60s TV sitcom housewife, by the way. Anyway, those water buffalo species, they fill in where cows are impractical. And the yaks and the water buffaloes are each descendants of different bovids. Along with the non-cow bovids, there are also a fair sprinkling of island-isolated bovine species hanging out in the repeatedly exciting collection of islands between Vietnam and Papua New Guinea. But every European, Asian, and African agricultural and pastoral society seems to agree, as long as there is enough water, bovids generally, and cows particularly, are handy animals to have around for muscle power, milk products, their manure, sometimes for their blood even while they're living, and when they reach the end of their useful working lives, for their meat, hide, sinews, brains, horns, and bones. They are a mobile form of wealth and food and a good way to convert land that is useless for growing crops, usually because it's too dry or too wet, into productive farmland. So it is with this view of the world that cows are brought to America a couple of times. Cows are useful. Cows are signs of civilization, and most importantly, cows are owned. They are not wild. The first time European cows are brought to America, it is by the Spanish in the 16th century. They were typically left on islands to breed and manage themselves to be a meat supply depot for passing Spanish ships and the sugar plantation economy. The tradition of you-pick livestock has largely died out in the modern age, but it seemed a reasonable solution to New World cash crop farming and treasure convoy resupply problems back then. The second introduction was as part of the Spanish mission and encomienda colonization efforts. Among other things, these cows would become part of the legendary Pampas herds managed by the gauchos of stage, screen, and soccer mascot fame. They were valued more for their hides than anything else and would play a supporting role in the South and Central American independence movements, and also escaped to wander about the future state of Texas. These typically longhorn cattle will star in some action-packed 19th century food episodes far in the future. But the cows of 17th century British colonial America were the relatively roly-poly, short-horned plow pullers and milk makers of the British Isles. They were also pretty close relatives of the cows the Dutch had brought with them to the island of Manhattan and the Hudson River Valley. We'll talk more about the Dutch cows when we take a closer look at the Dutch colonies, so for now we are sticking to the British Atlantic. When the first European explorers and colonists arrived in New England, one thing they noticed was the gentle rolling hills uncluttered by fences and completely devoid of livestock, particularly cows. And the New England colonists were feeling very cow-aware at this point. Some because they had spent time in Holland and seen that orderly, prosperous world festooned with cheese and butter, but many others had come directly from England. While some of them had been booted from the country for holding the wrong religion du jour, many others were in a time to try the new world frame of mind because they had just been booted off their land due to the new Enclosures Acts. Now, the Enclosures Acts were a series of laws and rules that really started ramping up in the 17th century. They would be at their height in the 18th century, but additions and alterations and consolidations would continue to be added until the 20th century. There were many facets to them, but generally it was a broader change in agricultural technology. Land owned by large landowners had historically been divided into very small strips and plots, which were worked by peasant families that had the right to reside there. But now this land was being combined into larger pieces to be farmed as larger fields, or filled with sheep for the expanding wool trade. The laborers working the land or tending the sheep changed from being peasants with residential rights to employees who had fewer claims on the landowners, including a loss of those residence rights. Also, land that had been available as commons for hunting, foraging, or seasonal grazing was being rezoned as well. It was becoming private property instead of common private property. The result was families that had been residents working plots of land for generations found themselves with a payout of sorts, but nowhere to call home, and their access to traditional resources had been curtailed. Many people went from living on a combination of fairly stable subsistence and cash crop farming to effectively becoming migrant workers inside their own country within a generation or two. And the most visible symbol of these new larger plots of land were the fences. They might be stone walls, hedgerows, or wooden fences. And animals, cows in particular, walking around on what had been fields worked by small farmers. And then, with naval warfare and colonial adventures ramping up, the demand for salt beef for the British fleets was becoming a more profitable venture. For a large landowner, raising cows had a better bottom line than small-scale farming by a bunch of separate peasant families that had ancient rights and privileges, however small. The Enclosure Acts also were the beginning of the end of the practice of communal seasonal grazing of cattle. taking them to some pastures in the spring or summer, and somebody living with them, and then returning them close to the farm for the fall and winter. Enclosures were seen as a more civilized, modern, and efficient way of doing things, where people were housed year-round. It made the practice of pastoral living, where people lived in tents or shacks and traveled with the cows and didn't have a permanent home for around half the year, that seemed rougher, behind the times, less civilized. So by the 17th century, England was quickly talking itself into the idea that cows in fenced fields were the height of civilization, and people who didn't fence their cows or didn't have fenced fields at all were a degraded, inferior version of English civilization. Therefore, one of the notes repeatedly made about Virginia and New England was that it would be great for cows, and it was ripe for colonization because no one owned the land. The early explorers could tell this because there were no fences, and no one was keeping livestock of any sort in fenced enclosures. The first few boatloads of colonists contained no cows, but it didn't take long for livestock shipments that included cows to start arriving. Now, it may seem odd that while the Spanish colonies were awash in cattle by the 17th century, to the point where cows were slaughtered for their hides and the meat was practically given away for free, that the British colonists would go to all the trouble of importing cows from England. But as I hinted at earlier, cows are not interchangeable. The Spanish cows were typically larger, long-horned, thin-hipped, semi-wild, and with bad tempers and stringy meat, and were not bred for dairying. English cows, on the other hand, were bred for milk production, generally had more docile tempers, so the oxen, castrated males, made good draft animals. And while 17th century cows were not mainly meat animals, the British were rather proud of their roasted beef. English and Irish cows were meant to be kept in monitored herds or fenced enclosures, not wander semi-wild about the plains with self-defense capabilities. Oh, and the English and the Spanish were definitely on the outs in the 17th century, so that was another reason not to get cows from them. Attempts to import cows to the British colonies were made in Virginia and New England. Due to spotty record keeping, it is a bit hard to determine just how many of the journeys were successful, but quite a few of them must have been, since there were several hundred cattle each in Virginia, the Carolinas, and in the northern colonies by the middle of the 17th century. And there are notes made of cattle arriving in Plymouth and the Charles River in Boston, Salem, Mystic in Connecticut, on the Chesapeake Bay, and on the Cape Fear River in Charleston in the Carolinas. As far as ferrying the cows, usually pregnant heifers and heifers with new calves were sent. Heifers with new calves could actually provide milk for the ship. Only rarely were grown bulls sent on the boats because even amongst the best-tempered breeds of cows, the bulls are much more aggressive. And since even the most stoic of us can get pretty cranky when seasick, just imagine a bad-tempered bull locked in a box on a ship. Well, no one really wanted to deal with that. The conditions for English cow shipping were a bit haphazard. Cow mortality on the trip over wasn't uncommon. Unlike the Dutch, who often sent a cow keeper with each animal, who got bonuses based on cow health and survival, the English were quite a bit more muddle-through about it. Losing as many as half the cows sent on a ship was not unheard of. Anyway, through several voyages and much cow purchasing, successful herds of cows were established in Virginia, then in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, with cows moving to other parts of New England, and then there was a lot of filling in between. The New England cows appear to have been mainly Devon types and the Dutch Holstein Friesians, but because the Virginia and Carolina River tobacco communities were vibrant trading and smuggling hubs early on with the Caribbean, they started getting some Spanish cattle from the Caribbean islands. That means the Virginia and Carolina cows were much more of a mishmash of types. And here's another funny thing. Just as most of the early colonists were not particularly successful farmers, they weren't that great at cow husbandry either. And as they realized that building houses and preparing food and sending tobacco or timber products back to England were the primary orders of business, making pens and barns and corn and hay ricks for the cows was very low on the list. So the fences were built around the gardens to keep cows out, and the cows were allowed to roam free. Fenced cows may have been the mark of civilization, but the first things just about all the colonists did was let the cows wander about. As you might imagine, when Native American villages were in any sort of close proximity to the colonists, the cows would go for their unfenced gardens. Unsurprisingly, local tribes, when they saw this great lumbering slab of extremely catchable meat chowing down on the fall harvest of squash, they would scoop it up to manufacture a good supply of jerky along with next week's worth of dinners. Also, unsurprisingly, the colonists would get very upset that their cows were getting killed and eaten just because they were trespassing on plants that didn't even look like proper English farms or gardens. In the New England colonies, this conflict was eventually solved with the potent combination of building fences, pushing out local tribes, enslaving them and sending them to the Caribbean, or by killing them with imported British diseases. In Virginia and the Carolinas, there was definitely some fence building, but there was also a surprise casting. Just as the many enslaved West Africans proved valuable as farmers in Virginia and South, those from cattle-raising communities proved to be good at managing cows. Yes, the very first cowboys to walk the range with cattle herds in colonial America were West African and Afro-Caribbean boys. West Africa, especially in what is modern Nigeria and Cameroon, has a long history of using cows as portable wealth, as well as food and material sources. While some West African cow owners lived a completely nomadic pastoral lifestyle, it was actually more typical for families to be tied to a village, but to have family members, often teenage boys, to be tasked with living with the cows as they are moved around seasonal pastures to find good forage and move away from seasonal insects and other parasites. This was almost exactly the pattern of cow keeping that the Enclosure Acts were in the process of stamping out in England, and was actually a really familiar way of life in large parts of 17th century Europe. In fact, though the livestock are goats, the popular book Heidi by Joanna Spyri from the end of the 19th century depicts Heidi's goatherd friend Peter as one of these livestock-following kids. Now, there's a long way to go and many other pieces to pick up before we get to the shape of the 20th century cowboy. But just like pumpkins, the American cowboy is another idea that comes from a myriad of non-American sources and is yet one of our global export ideas. It has been so distilled down to this flattened shadow show of itself, the 17th century origins are not just unrecognizable, they're almost unimaginable. So ironically, though the English adventurers and colonists wrote home about how super excited they were about penning up cows as soon as possible to civilize the wild new world, the first thing they did was send cows out to roam the ranges. As a result, the 17th century American cow was not the pampered or at least closely monitored animal of England. The early American cow had to range far and wide to find forage, especially in the winter, instead of being provided with hay in a cozy barn. Calves especially were subject to predation by wolves and occasionally by wildcats. Since the range of the American bison came almost up to the edge of early American colonial settlements, the apex predators of the region would be familiar with hunting bovids. Wait, what am I talking about? Are you saying there's bison in New England? Now, just in case this sounds nuts, remember, the name of the town, Buffalo, New York, totally made sense when it was named that in the early 19th century. Bison were a pretty common sight around Lake Erie and in the western part of what is New York State. In the 17th century, imported European cows were not yet competing with the local bovids, but they soon would be. So it turns out that just as with vegetable farming, the playbook of how to do cows and Why have cows in colonial America was very different depending on whether you were in northern and the New England colonies or you were in Virginia and South. Generally, the single-family farm was the goal of the colonists up north, so the milk cow and raising a few oxen for labor on your farm, and then later as meat for local consumption, was the focus. The herds were smaller and the cows stayed local. Virginia and South, cash cropping was more often the focus. Oxen as plowing and transport labor and as meat exports to the Caribbean was the industry. The sugar plantations were outsourcing more and more of their food production as the number of owners dwindled and the size of the plantations ballooned. So in the South, the cows were more of a cog in an export-facing economic system. So the herds were typically larger than they were on the northern family farms. Dairy production went on, but it would have mainly been for local consumption and less of a focus of the southern cow industry. Now that we have the cow firmly established in America, next week we'll look at how beef was eaten in the 17th century British Atlantic and mainly learn that steak was almost never for dinner. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. If you prefer to email me, questions and quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really will make a difference and will help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for this episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. Links to the show notes are also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.